Hey everyone, how's it going? So by now it should be no surprise that I quite like Specialized. I've built a few Hardrocks up on the channel before. Today we're going to be doing this 89 Specialized Hardrock in this really cool pink and white colorway. So I've got a trip coming up to Sydney later in the week, and this one is a bit too small for me, so it feels a bit more disposable, and it's kind of cool building up a new bike for a trip anyway. So we're going to be building this one up. The back swept bars didn't quite suit it, so we're going with a Surly Sunrise instead, which sort of upsizes the bike a little bit. There's some surface rust on the bike. It looks like we should be able to clean this up. It's kind of just mostly stain on the paint, just with some little dots of rust and stuff. Some more on the back here as well. We should be able to clean that up. There's a few different ways to do that, but first we've got to get out the bottom bracket just to make sure that we can actually replace the bottom bracket, but that comes out no worries. A lot of the time these steel bottom brackets don't get stuck in steel frames. It's mostly like the alloy cup ones with the galvanic corrosion reacting with the steel frame. So I've had this bike for a while. I sold it to a friend who didn't build it up either. So I think I initially got this bike about 1.5, 2 years or so ago, and it's just sort of been sitting around like in our sheds since. So the bottom bracket came out just fine. There's a little bit of rust dust in the bottom bracket shell, but no internal rust, so that's pretty good. First of all, we're going to clean off any debris and stuff to make sure we don't scratch up too much of the paint, although we are going to be sanding the area. So some of that rust stain comes off just by wiping it off, but we're going to go a step further and sort of tackle this and best prevent rust from spreading in the future. We're going to be sanding the area, and that's going to prep it, get rid of some extra rust and stuff, and then we're going to rust convert it. And then after that we'll go over with some clear coat as well. That'll sort of seal it even better. So just sanding, you see it gets rid of some of the extra little rust bits and stuff. It does wear through some of the paint, but that's 2,500 grit, so it doesn't really do too much damage to the paint. And we are going to clear coat it anyway, so yeah. I use this synthetic wool. This is quite fine. I just use that to get in some of the extra little bits where the paint isn't even, so it does really well with uneven surfaces. That's how the front end of it cleaned up as well. Looking heaps better. Still got a couple little bits to do, but looking really good. Just going to take the fork out now, then we'll go through. I kind of want to get rid of the rust on the headset cups, so we'll soak those in some evaporust. This headset still feels really good. The rust isn't really detrimental to the structure of it. It's just looks a little bit ugly, so we're just going to clean that off. So cleaning up the frame, getting that ready for the rust converter. Just want to get off any of the oils and that sort of stuff that will spread around on the frame. Pink and the decals in this bike are in really good condition. So that's what we're left with. Just a few little bare spots of steel. Nothing too crazy. Yeah, the decals, a lot of them fade really, really badly, but these are in pretty good condition. So what we're going to be treating the bare steel with is this rust converter. Basically, this just paints on really easily. This is it's fine to use with bare hands and stuff. It basically just turns the rust black. It doesn't matter too much if you get it over on the paint. It sort of dries to like a clear film. That's the bike all done, so you can see like a few black dots over it. And then we're going to seal the whole thing with gloss clear. You probably should cover up the brake posts and some of the bolts and stuff, but this is a pretty thin clear coat. We're just going to do about 3 coats or so. The paint wasn't in too bad condition, but it did need a bit of extra shine. Now we're going to put some of the parts in evaporust so we can let those soak while we're doing other things. So some of the things that need evaporusting are, all the brake bolts and everything of the brake levers. Just got to make sure that you don't lose those circlips, so I just put like a magnet on there. And these tiny little grub screws. So the brake pin was pretty well stuck in there. There's quite a bit of rust in there, so we'll put that in the evaporust and that'll clean that up. Pretty badly pitted, but hopefully cleaning the rust off will make it a bit smoother. The brake lever felt pretty rough. So these are the headset cups. That's just the top bearing race and the bottom bearing cup. So obviously the evaporust isn't going to repair the damaged chrome, but it's going to get rid of the rust, and we'll go through after that and we'll clear coat it. So this is the parts the next day. Probably about 16 hours or so in the evaporust. You can see just wiping it off, the rust just comes off basically, so we're going to go through and scrub the headset cups, and that's how they show up. Looking really good. You can see the chrome is still damaged, but it's not going to keep rusting, so that's good. Pretty good condition. And that's how the brake pivot bolts. Not really bolts, they're more like pins. Don't have any thread on them. And then, yeah, just some clear coat on the headset pieces. Just going to prevent that from rusting further. Greasing up the headset, putting the headset cup back in. Use some anti-seize or just grease. It makes it go on nice and smooth and even, and going to prevent it from getting stuck in there in the future. This is just some threaded rod or all thread to make like a headset press. Pretty simple, just a couple of bolts and some washers and stuff. You can't see it in the camera there, but I'm holding the top of the threaded rod so it doesn't turn around while I'm tightening it. Then greasing up the bearings to put it back together. The grease that I use is just an all-purpose wheel bearing grease. It's a waterproof grease, does really well. I get this from Super Cheap Auto. You could get this in New Zealand or Australia. I'm sure there's something else in other countries that does really well. I don't buy like Park Tool crazy expensive grease or anything like that. This does really well. Yeah. Headset feels pretty good. I put a bit of the excess grease inside the stereo tube. I hate these. I hate these little nubs. If you're new around here, I always file these nubs off. I've seen so many of them damage stereo tube threads. It sort of is a locating part that sort of prevents the tightening of the top nut from readjusting the headset, but it's just not worth it. Just take it off. You can adjust the headset fine without it. Putting lots of grease on the quill bolt and everything. This is a stem converter, so this is a 1-inch headset, so it's a 22.2 quill converter, and that goes up to a 28.6 for a regular 1/1/8 stem. The only thing I don't really like about this quill converter is that it has this pretty ugly bend or change in diameter to it. There are some that go hard square, so look pretty good, but to cover up that curve, it kind of just looks like a gap. It looks a little bit funny. So to cover that up, you can either put a bell there. I think that's a pretty good location for a bell. You can still reach it pretty easily. Or you can just use some headset spacers. With the curve there and the curve on the top of the headset lock nut, it sort of indexes, so it doesn't really cause any issues. Sometimes if it doesn't have, like if the top nut is flat or something, the spacers can shift around. You can build up the quill converter underneath that with some tape or something, and that just stops it from rattling around. But normally just press fit and it stays put. So it's important to remember where these washers go. So in these brake levers there's 2 thickness washers. So the thinner one goes on either side of the brake lever blade. They're a larger diameter but a bit thinner. They go there, and then spring goes into that little hole, and then the brake lever blade goes in, and then on the brake lever pivot there's the other ones. These are a bit thicker but smaller diameter. Then you can push the pin through, use a bit of grease through here because as you saw they do rust. Then you just need to make sure that the pin goes through far enough that you can get that circlip back on. This is kind of a finicky little time. I hate these tiny little circlips. This one doesn't have any holes, so you can't use like circlip pliers or anything, but just using my little 5mm Allen key, pushing that on. And apparently chipping my fingernail somewhere in the process. But eventually we get it in, and then just put that grub screw back in. I guess with the circlip that grub screw doesn't do too much, but probably just locks it in there a bit better. Then that's the brake levers all done. Feeling a lot smoother. They weren't binding too bad, but they had a bit of extra resistance. The shifters that we're using are these dual 9-speed ones, and they fit the brake levers really well actually. So sometimes they're a bit too bulky and stuff, but they seem to play nicely with these Avid levers. So like I mentioned earlier, we're using the Surly Sunrise bar. This is just a handlebar that I had sitting around that had decent rise and everything to it. Looks really cool with this Colony stem as well. Big fan of the Colony front load stems. The cranks we're going to be using on the bike are these Shimano 4x104 BCD cranks. I just seem to have a bunch of 104 BCD chainrings kicking around. These are just non-series Shimano arms, but I don't really want them to be black. I've got some silver wheels for the bike that will suit it quite nicely. So I thought I'd try some paint stripper on these arms, and then I can try and polish them up. I don't know if they're powder coated or painted, but it turns out they're painted. This paint stripper isn't very good. Apparently there's an aerosol one that you can get at Bunnings and stuff that works really well, but I haven't tried that, so I just use some cardboard to spread it around. You can use a brush or something, but it normally destroys brushes, so just use a bit of cardboard. It took a long time and a bunch of different coats of this paint stripper, but eventually you can see on that top one that we did get there in the end. Took a bit of scraping and a whole lot of time, but we got there in the end. I didn't know how well the masking would work. It's sort of just crammed into the edge there. You can't remove the spider too easily. It's got like a lock ring that's punched on there, but did a pretty good job. I'd say the masking tape just had a couple little spots where it wasn't quite stuck down properly. A few little bits of paint left on the crank arm, so I just used this synthetic wool again, and just a little bit of water, a little bit of soapy water, and get the last little bits off. I didn't strip the inside of the crank arms, just to save time. Doesn't really matter too much. And I didn't know how this would go. These crank arms aren't finished like 100%. You can see there's some tiny little unevenness to them, but they look pretty good. So I just use my bench polisher now, which does a really good job of polishing things up and doesn't take too long. Just spent probably a couple minutes polishing each one. Initially I was just going to do a 2x setup, so 2x9. You'll sort of see eventually why I chose to go triple instead, but for now I'm just setting it up double and see how that goes. I use a bit of blue Loctite in the crank bolts, the chainring bolts, sorry. Make sure that they don't wobble loose. It's pretty common. And then in the actual crank arm I just use some grease, because don't really need it in these ones. They seem to lock in quite nicely. And you'll notice there, some of the bolts are a little bit rusty, because I didn't think ahead too well. Throwing some grease in the bottom bracket shell. Now we're going to throw the bottom bracket in. You can see there's a little bit of damage from the chain suck on the chainstay there. And making sure we get the grease in everywhere. I push it in to all the threads and everything, and I normally put some even in the spots without threads. It just sort of prevents it from rusting and corroding further down the track. So this is about 110 or 111 millimeter bottom bracket width, and it's a 68 millimeter shell. So it's quite a short bottom bracket, but these crank arms tend to need it. You can see it didn't quite want to go in there because of the little bottom bracket cable guide. This happens quite a lot when going from an unsealed unit to a sealed unit. So just file down that nub and make sure that it can still work just fine. You can see it's still a little bit popping out there. We had to trim down the screw that goes through there as well, but got that all back in there. Now the bottom bracket goes in nice and smooth, doesn't get hung up on that. Push that in all the way, you can see all the excess grease coming out there. I normally just wipe that off and then either put it on the taper inside or on the seat post, and that'll go inside the frame later on. Just smear like a little bit on the square taper and snug everything down. So snug the drive side down, and then the non-drive side is an adjustable one, so you just snug that down until it's snug. So putting the crank arm on with its 2x setup. I tend to run into this issue when doing 2x, so chain line looked good, decent amount of clearance there to the chainstays, but I didn't have any derailleurs that could close up that gap, and that just looks ridiculous. So I'm going to throw on a bigger chainring. We're just going to run it 3x. I've got this pretty cool, I really like this group set, XT group set. It's kind of known as the bubble group set, but it works really well. It's still got like the little cable outlet covers, and even like the clip that covers that, so pretty good. So it's in pretty good condition, just needs a bit of a clean up, nothing too crazy though. Just going to clean off the pulley wheels. Still has the factory sealed bearing actually, lower pulley, which is pretty cool. Top one's just a bushing, as most of them are. Just pulling out the little seals, then go through and clean it all out. That's the lower one with the sealed bearing on it. Pretty cool. You can see the back cage. What do you call it? Whatever. it's a little bit crusty, so I just wire wheel that off. And then this is some isopropyl alcohol. Just hitting it with some edge primer. Then while that dries, putting on this is a 44 tooth chainring. So 44, and then the middle I think was a 32, then the small one was a 22 tooth. Cassette out the back, I'm going with the 11 to 32, so that gives us a really good range. It's basically like the equivalent of having a 51 tooth out the back. So now I've got some matte black on that. Kind of looks more satin, but anyway, it looks a whole lot better. Nice and clean derailleur. It's a tiny little bit of a run here, but it's mostly for rust prevention anyway, so quite nice. Just reassembling the derailleur now. Just use like a little bit of oil on the pulley wheels. You don't really need them, but and then putting this tiny little clip back on the little rubber boot. I haven't had one of these derailleurs that has this boot. in a really long time. Some of them have the one that goes over the barrel adjuster, like on the other side, but I think that's the first time I've had one of those clips. Just bolting the derailleur on now. The wheel we're using for this is a STX hub laced to this Mavic rim. It's a pretty wide profile double wall rim with eyelets on it. So it should be quite strong. It's got plenty of life left in it. Basically, we're going to be swapping on 9-speed axle and freehub onto the 7-speed. And then you just use the 7-speed non-drive side bearings and everything. So the axles might be the same width, it sort of just depends on what wheel you're going to be using. In this 7-speed STX setup, the axles were the same width, so it was 135 width both ways. But because we'd have to swap the cones over, it just made sense to use the axle as well. That way we don't have to change the drive side, and then you have to know what you're doing, otherwise that can be kind of complicated to get the spacing right. So just disassembling the STX hub. I normally go from the left hand side, just undoing all that. This is a wheel that I had serviced pretty recently, so bearings should be in pretty good condition. Just going to leave the non-drive side in there. Looks like the grease is still in really good condition. So that's the 7-speed free hub on the bottom there, and then the 9-speed one up top. So we could throw any cassette pretty much on there up to 12-speed. So that's the 9-speed axle and the bearings. Then the non-drive side parts from the STX hub. So just put some grease in the free hub there, and then we're going to put all the bearings in. To make sure the axle's all cleaned up. Then pretty much just reassembling. Got the bearings back in there, putting the cone back on. Then just using the spacers that we had originally. If your axles were a different width, you would have to use the spacers sort of to make up the different width from the 9-speed. That's it all sorted. Feels nice and smooth. So after that, you'll probably have to dish the wheel. That just involves undoing the nipples on one side, then doing them up on the other side. Normally about a rotation or rotation and a half seems to do it. Tyres that we're going to be using on the bike are these Maxxis Holy Roller. These are 26 by 2.4, so pretty chunky. These are a good urban tyre that you can still take off-road and do a decent amount of single track actually. They work really well. Just popping them up. Front wheel, we've got this Specialized Stout hub. They have a pretty cool system, so sealed bearings and then pretty thick axle that is also the crook release, so pretty cool. Kind of like an early through axle, I guess. Brakes we've got for this are these die-cut ones, just because these are the ones that I had in silver. I don't really keep many V-brakes around, but these should do nicely. Got a pretty different... I like how die-cut sort of does these weird spring setups. So it's not the typical Shimano one where it has the spring going up the outside. It's got like this little contained unit, kind of similar to how cantilever brakes are, I guess. Putting the front wheel in, just chucking it in there for the time being. So you'll notice that these tyres are used and they're quite dirty. So when I go to Australia, you have to scrub out all the dirt and everything from your tyres, but we need to ride the bike before then anyway, so. I got some cool brake pads for it. I'm not going to use those pink ones on it, but I'm going to use those on the rear. And then the front, we're just going to use the die-cut brake pads. It's kind of confusing because the arrows were pointing in a different way to what the orientation would be, so we're just going to throw those on however I feel. Getting the cables on the bike now, and then we'll throw the Cool Stop Eagle. I really like the salmon compound or the jewel compound, so the orange and black ones. They work really well. They're just so good. They work in mud and everything and the rain, so you can use them like all year round. As long as you have a bit of toe in, then they shed like the mud and everything. They do have like a little toe, what do you call it? They might have like a marketing thing for it, but at the front of the brake pad it has like a little extra angular like relief. But eventually that wears down and they'll wear flat. So you will need to put in some toe eventually, but for the time being, just set them up. Yeah, just straightforward, so just hard up against the rim. They call it like their plow system? I can't remember. So I've got all the cables on the bike now. I used pink and white cables, sort of mixed it around. Then just go through and adjust the gears. I don't really do indexing on my own bikes that often, but at the bike shop pretty much every bike is indexed, so pretty straightforward. Just set the limit screws and then add a little bit of cable tension to make sure it shifts up and down freely. So this worked really well. I did have the B limit screw in about halfway, otherwise it was grinding on that 32 tooth. But I'm pretty sure that this derailleur does a 34 as well, so whether this derailleur hanger is a bit too short for that, I don't really know. Throwing a bit of lube on, and then the pedals. We've got these Haro BMX ones. They're a nylon pedal, or plastic, I don't know. But they're a plastic pedal, not metal pedal. Just using a bit of anti-seize on the axle. And I put some on the crank arm as well, but you don't see that. And tightening that down. And same with the other side. Last thing to do is the seat post. So you can see I've sort of polished up a tiny little bit to see how it will look. So that's how it was before. Just putting that grease back in the seat tube. And that little part is, I quickly polished it up just to see how it would look, and then we'll go through, do the rest of it. You can do a pretty good job just with autosol on seat posts. So don't feel like you need a bench grinder set up. This is one I got from my granddad when he passed away. Putting in the anti-seize or grease down in the seat tube, make sure that the seat post isn't going to get stuck for anyone. And one of the last things is grips. So I got these a while ago because, well, I normally like the chunky ESI grips. They smell really good too, but really comfy. But just use some isopropyl alcohol, just put a little bit in the grip and then on the bar as well. Kind of tricky to get on because they sort of shrink, so you have to really force it to open it onto there, but use a lot of isopropyl alcohol and get it on there nicely. And then measure it to make sure that you haven't stretched it, otherwise it will end up tearing. And then just banging in the bar ends. So a while ago I was trying to find some of the chunky and pink, but I couldn't find them. But they had about 2 or 3 sets of the extra chunky left, so I just bought those and I've just been sitting on them since, because I didn't want to run out of pink grips. So this is the bike all done. I don't really like impractical bikes though, so we're going to throw a front rack on. Just prevents back sweat and everything. Like, unless it's a fixed gear, I feel like I can put a rack on, but I do also put racks on fixed gears. So I was hoping to use these little converters, but it didn't quite fit the bike. So I normally just make up my own anyway, but I wanted to try these out. They'll fit something else though, so no real loss. You can just get those from Blue Log. Nice little rack adapter. They come in quick release or bolt-on versions. It's a little bit different, so make sure you get the right one. So just rubbing on the area, and that sort of creates like a bit of a template to see where the holes and everything need to be. Then we're going to hold the rack in the right place to make sure that we actually do it long enough. From here, I would normally put onto like some steel flat bar, but the only steel flat bar that I had was 25 millimeters wide, so we're going to use this aluminium flat plate instead. I have used it before and it works okay. I'm guessing it won't last as long, but it's quite stiff, so it should be okay. That's it. all mocked up. You can see, pretty stiff. It's not going to really cause too many issues. And that's it all bolted up. Just going to throw on a basket now. This is a Wald 137. I normally just zip tie these on. Never had any issues with them just zip tied on. I've actually had a bike mounted on top of a basket that's been zip tied on. If you don't trust your zip ties, just get some better zip ties, I guess. I don't know. Haven't had any issues. That's the bike all done. So we are going to take this bike to Sydney, but for the time being, still in Auckland, so can take it for a ride with some mates. So we just take it off to Ambury Farm.
Yeah.
We had a really early morning bike ride last Sunday. We took off about 6:30 in the morning, so we had our lights on and everything. This is the bike all done. I'll say a little bit more at the end of the video, but for now it's just going to be some clips of the bike and then some riding. So I'll see you at the end.
Okay.
Oh. So the bike did really well on the ride. I didn't know if it was going to be any chain skipping or anything like that because they're all chain rings, but worked really well. Plenty of braking power from the V-brakes, and especially with the cool stop pads on the rear. I normally run mismatch pads, so just like generic ones on the front. Then it sort of feels like it's even braking, because you normally have a little bit more braking power from the front brake anyway. Not the easiest thing to wheelie. I haven't had too much practice. That was like the first time trying, but I did get a couple ones that were like a few pedal strokes in. Thanks heaps to Nicholas for all the drone footage. This is him trying it out. This is a DJI Neo, so I think I might have to get one of these, especially for the following feature. That's really cool. Awesome quality, really cool colors on it and everything. So like I said earlier in the video, I'm going to be taking this bike to Sydney. I don't know if I'll bring it back from Sydney or if I'll put it up for sale, but yeah, keep an eye out on social media for that. After this bike, we've got a couple of really cool mountain bikes. I don't know which one I'm going to do next, but I've also got a Look KG221 road bike, so that'll be coming up soon. Thanks for checking the video out, and I'll see you shortly. Thanks. Bye.